And take a moment to introduce two people from the Prep West program in Western Massachusetts. We have the director of Prep West, Melissa Weise, who's the director, and we also have a nurse practitioner, Julie Bermant. Please welcome Julie and Melissa. Thank you.
So microphones and I are not usually very good friends, so let me know if you hear me? Yes, okay, good. So I'm Melissa. I'm the director of the PrEP program. And
I'm Julie, and I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I work 12 hours a week in the program.
Right, and I'm a clinical social worker. And I'm actually, on a side note, I'm super happy to be here. I actually grew up in Oregon, and so this is like where my heart is, even though I'm now living in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, which now has another piece of my heart. So my heart's sort of torn across the two sides of the country. So we'd like to welcome you to our talk about building a program to intentionally incorporate intersectionality in the way in which we work. And when I talk about intersectionality, I really like Melanie Souché's writing. If anybody's familiar with her writing, this is from her paper, Unraveling Whiteness, where she talks about her own work as a clinician and being intentionally intersectional in an individual dyadic way in the room. So what she says, one of the quotes that I think is so powerful from her paper is, "I expose the deep feelings of guilt and shame, the layers of melancholia, and then the experiences of acceptance and surrender." And so the real frame for this, the frame for intersectional work, as I'm understanding it, as we're understanding it, is that it's a process, it's a journey, and it's painful, and it's poignant. It's not for the faint of heart. It's something that we have to be willing to reflect inward, and all of our implicit biases and life experiences. And this morning we heard about ancestral knowledge, ancestral experiences. All of that is contained within us as mental health practitioners, clinicians, and all of humanity. And so in order to do the work, we have to do the work on ourselves. And then to apply it to a program means that you have to create the space for everybody in that program to be doing that work, which that's a big job. Intersectionality, it was funny, I was talking to a colleague of mine on Thursday when I flew in, trying to explain what my talk was about, or what our talk was about. And she's a longtime social worker, mentor of mine. And at the end, she's like, "Melissa, I've never even heard of intersectionality. I don't even know what that is." And so I think it's a new concept to a lot of people. And in thinking about this and in writing this, I did a little bit of sort of historical uncovering of how the mental health profession has gone through this parallel process of acknowledging all the identities of oppression that are happening in our culture. And so it took us a really long time to get to any place where we had language for this. In the 1990s, it really became evident when we talked about multiculturalism, where we were starting to acknowledge and talk about oppressed identities and different experiences and different stories. But the critique of that is, how do you practice in a multicultural way, and how do you do it in a way that you don't lose nuance and story and make everybody homogenous, and that we're all just celebrating multiculturalism, but what is that exactly? So then in the early 2000s, you start hearing the terminology around cultural competence, which I think is trying to programmatize or mobilize or find a way to do multiculturalism, to acknowledge it in a mental health way. As a social worker, it becomes part of my sort of code of ethics and expectations, is that we become culturally competent. But the question there is, what does that mean? How can I be expected? How can any one of us be expected to become competent in cultures and all the different diversity in the world? How is it possible for me to read books and somehow stand up in front of people and say, I arrived, I'm competent now. I'm practicing competently. And I always sort of found that as an arrogant practice. It was an attempt, a really great attempt, but arrogant. And so the more contextualized and I think helpful frame that I've discovered is the frame of cultural humility. And I don't know how familiar anybody is in the room with cultural humility. It was developed by Doctors Tervalon and Murray Garcia, or written about by them, and now it's been written about and discussed by a lot of people. And essentially, it incorporates 3 principles. So the principles of cultural humility are lifelong learning and self-reflection, what Melanie Souchet is talking about right at the get-go, that it starts with us. It starts with our willingness to learn in a humble way, to not learn book knowledge and then think that we're some sort of an expert, but recognize that this is going to be lifelong and that we're going to be continually learning, which quite frankly can be a continually painful process. It also acknowledges or asks us to recognize that these systems and identities and experiences of difference are continually changing and that there are power imbalances. And then it takes it to a macro level where it asks us to then hold our institutions accountable to these experiences of difference and oppressed identities. So it seems like a much more appropriate way to work than from just I'm going to be culturally competent and I've arrived. It acknowledges a process. And like I had said before, we have to make space for the process. And in our chaotic world of making sure that our billing is done and making sure that we're getting supervision and making sure that we're doing our paperwork, it can be very hard to make the intentional space to work on that really hard process. Not only that, it's really hard. And so it's easier to kind of shy away and go, well, I need to do these other evidence-based things that I'll do that later.
I'm going to use
you
this
got
one. Yeah. So early psychosis is a clinical concept that came about in the late 1990s, and it was thought that there were stages of psychosis, and that if we could identify early psychosis, identify in the prodromal stages, that we could really affect the trajectory of the illness, of what happened, and that we could prevent complications. So, and I know that I'm saying this in using a medical model, and that is the model that I come from, but it's not necessarily the model that I'm fully operating in the program. So early psychosis affects about 100,000 youth and young adults in the US every year. The peak is between 15 and 25. And there is a difference in prevalence rates. So it was felt to be about 3%. Now they're looking at it being 5 to 8% in the general population. What's been identified is that the duration of untreated psychosis, or the DUP, which is the start of symptoms to the start of treatment. And that treatment can be many things, but that period of time really affects the way that people experience psychosis. That the earlier we can treat, the earlier we can get involved after the symptoms occur, the better off people are. The TIPS project in Norway showed that they were able to take their DUP from 1.5 years down to a half a year, and the 5-year outcomes were dramatically better. People were much more engaged in the community, more likely to be working, more likely to be in school. The Weise study began in 2008, and now in the past year there's been a lot of papers coming out about the effect of the Weise interventions, and those interventions included psychosocial supports, family engagement, individualized therapy, individualized medication management, substance abuse treatment, supported employment, and peer support. And it was found that by having those interventions, not simply treating people with medication, that the outcomes were much better. And because the outcomes were so much better, there was federal funds that were released to fund early psychosis programs, and that happened much more quickly, even before all the papers were published. That money was released, and our program exists because of those funds.
So our parent program is called Servicenet in Western Massachusetts. It's one of the larger mental health organizations that does a whole bunch of things. And they applied for some of the funds from this mental health block grant, the set-aside block grant. And the PrEP program started, we just started our third year, so we've been in existence for 2 years, which is, I think we're in that generation of the younger early psychosis programs. We were a little bit modeled after, if anybody's familiar with the PrEP East program, which has been in existence for a lot longer than us, and so it was sort of out of that inspiration that we were modeled. We're a multi-disciplinary, and the centrality of our program is around a milieu, in the idea that building community, which I've heard a lot throughout the conference already, is central to people's wellness, to have other individuals with which they feel connected, but where people can also share experiences that they're not necessarily sharing with other people outside the program, and I've seen that happen in very poignant ways. We also offer an array of services, I think, to contextualize this. In Western Massachusetts, there's long wait lists, I think, which is true for a lot of the country, but not all of the country, limited resources, just overall. And so we try to offer one-stop shopping. We have medication services, we have outpatient mental health therapy, we have a peer specialist, employment, but it's all centered around the milieu. And our clinical frame is open dialogue informed. We practice from a lot of modalities, CBT for psychosis, narrative therapy, etc., but our frame is open dialogue.
So there's been a lot of talk about open dialogue this weekend, and we will be talking about how we use the open dialogue model particularly in our program, which is a little bit different than anything that I've heard so far this weekend. We really work to create a non-hierarchical community, and so the discussion that just happened around peer supports and peer mentors really fits in. We work, our frame is to be non-hierarchical, and although we are not always successful because of traditional differences in power dynamics, it really is what we are consciously trying to do, and we continue to talk about the ways that works and the ways it doesn't work. But open dialogue really supports that non-hierarchical model. We also work to integrate intersectionality and cultural humility within our open dialogue informed practice. So open dialogue began in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Western Lapland, and in that area, which is one needs to know is a very homogeneous population and has a centralized medical system, but they were able to decrease their duration of untreated psychosis by 90%. And they were able to take that 6-month DUP that was already amazing and bring it down to 3 weeks. And the 5 and 10-year follow-ups have shown that 81% of the people who entered the program were working or in school and were not experiencing symptoms. So there are 7 principles in open dialogue, and I know that other people have mentioned them. I am going to go through them again, and I'm going to talk about what the model sees as how those principles should be presented, and what we do at the PrEP program with the limitations that we have. So the first principle is immediate help, and in the open dialogue model in Finland and in some of the other programs that I've heard about, it's really within 24 hours of symptoms, having people involved with the person of concern. And in our location-based program, that's not possible. We don't have the outreach availability that we would like to have. But we do try to engage with people during their first hospitalization. That's typically when we meet them. People don't have to have been hospitalized in order to get referred to our program. Anybody can self-refer. But most typically, that's when we're meeting people, is during the first hospitalization, going and having a meeting at the hospital, and then getting people engaged as quickly as we can. Sometimes that's right as they come out of the hospital, and sometimes if we've had a lot of people coming into the program, we need to sort of slow that down a little bit, because we just can't have a lot of new people coming in all at once. It's not fair to the people coming in if we can't give them the attention and support that we want to give them as they enter the program. The second is a social network perspective, and that really looks at including as many people around the person of concern as possible, and that may be family members. And typically at our program, those are the people who are coming to our meetings, our family members, but it might be bosses, it might be neighbors, it might be friends, it might be coworkers. Anybody that the person of concern sees as a support is invited into that social network. And the social network perspective is not only a supportive network, but also allows various perspectives to be part of the treatment. So we get to know how people functioned, or how they want to function, or how they have, what their hopes and dreams are, or what their passions are. Even though they may not be able to verbalize that themselves at this point, we're able to kind of integrate that into our network and into our process. Flexibility and mobility is the ability to go when and where people need. And in the open dialogue model in Finland, people are seen in coffee shops, and the New York model is also doing that, and we're very envious of that, to be able to go to people's workplaces, or go take a walk with them, or go to their homes. All of that is really what is very rich in the open dialogue model, and is not something that we typically can do. We are a location-based program, and so people need to come to us, and we are. It's pretty much a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 kind of timing. Again, it would be great to be able to open that up, but we don't have the staff to be able to do that at this point. So the fourth principle is responsibility, and that is bringing as much of the needs that clients or participants have into the network itself, into the community, rather than sending them somewhere else for job training, or for if they have issues around substance abuse. We try to bring that, as much of that, into our community team as we can. And we're pretty good at that. We do have a peer specialist who works on employment issues. We have a psychologist, we have social workers. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so I can prescribe. We have social work interns. So we have a lot of people who are there, and we really try to do as much within our community as we can. Psychological continuity is something that is another piece of this that in the ideal world would be wonderful to be able to do. It means that if someone is seen on an outpatient basis and they need to go inpatient, that they can be followed with the same team into the inpatient treatment, and then followed with the same team outpatient. And that's possible in Western Lapland because of their centralized system. But it's not at all possible in our system, and I think probably in most of the US that would be a pretty unusual thing to be able to do. But we do work on staying in contact with both the participant and the treating team when people have to go into the hospital, and we are ready and willing to help them transition back out again. Tolerance of uncertainty is acknowledging that we don't know what the future brings. And it's a very humbling place to be, and it's a place that is difficult to sit in because families and participants want to know if they've had a psychotic episode, and they want to know, is this going to happen again? What's the prognosis? What's the diagnosis? And we step back from that and really try to just say, we will be here with you along this journey. We don't know where the journey's going to go, but we will just be here and support, and we are not going to make any assumptions. We are not going to jump to diagnoses. The truth is we don't know. And then the dialogue with polyphony. Polyphony is many voices, and we take that social network perspective with as many of those people as possible and really work to get a lot of different perspectives in our meetings. And we do this both with families, and we also do this with our own treatment team. And we really work to get different perspectives brought into the team, brought into the meeting. We don't want everybody agreeing with each other, because the truth is that people aren't agreeing with each other. And if they're not sharing that disagreement in the meeting, then they're more likely to go off and have sort of a snippy conversation afterwards, feeling like they don't have any power. And if we can bring that into the meeting, we really can come up with better solutions because we have more information.
And it's not always about coming up with solutions either. Polyphony is also honoring that we're going to disagree, and that's okay to disagree.
Right. And we are also looking at and acknowledging that we're bringing the voices themselves into the room, and we're acknowledging that people who are hearing voices are not necessarily hearing voices that are agreeing with each other. And so we want to be modeling that it's possible for us to be together and not agree and have that be okay. The Prep West team was trained in these concepts through an open dialogue informed process over the course of 9 months. So we had 2 days a month for a total of 12 training days. And the training itself was very experiential and really encouraged us to self-reflect and to process the intersectionally and culturally humble issues that came up during the training itself. The training was, I'm not sure. So the training itself was very experiential, and so there were things that happened. I'm going to go back to the slide. Things that happened during that training that were that taught us a lot about ourselves and each other. So one of the things that happened was that we lined up based on the amount of time that we had been involved with the mental health system, either as consumers or as providers. And so these people that were just meeting each other were learning about how long we had been engaged. The team came together in August and early September of 2016. So Melissa as the director and myself as a nurse practitioner and 3 new social work interns who were going to be with the program for 9 months, 30 hours a week, each of them. All of us were brand new. We had a social worker and a psychologist who had been with the team less than 3 months. We had a peer specialist and a case manager who had been with the team less than a year. And the social work interns had actually expected, and I had expected to be working with the previous director who was open dialogue trained and who left during the summer of 2016. So we were all coming together, not knowing each other, not knowing the program, not knowing much about open dialogue, learning about this all together. I think this is you.
Is that me? We can be me. So, like Julie talked about, it's a brand new team, which gave us this sort of interesting process and sort of a gift. The gift was, it was a new program to begin with that had been around for just about a year, and then we had a new team all coming together, learning a new modality, which was a whole bunch of tolerating uncertainty. And it was this commitment to this lifelong learning and reflective process on ourselves. Julie had talked about some of the experiential things, the lining up. According to our years in the mental health system, there was no delineation intentionally between those of us who had received services and those of us who had given services. It was just how much time we had spent. There was an exercise where we told each other in dialogue how we became involved in a clinical role, which, quite frankly, if you think about that for any of yourselves, how you become involved with the mental health system, either as a provider or a participant, is quite a vulnerable story. And we all told those stories to each other in this very vulnerable, very new space.
There were also, we did a listening experience where someone, it happened to be me, told a story about a vulnerable time in my past and had all these people listen in different ways and then feed it back to me. And I felt so intensely heard in a way that was incredibly moving. We also practiced a 10-second pause. And we were interviewing each other about real events, and we knew what was happening. Obviously, we were all being trained at the same time. We all had the same information. And yet, having the interviewer stop for 10 seconds, which is a long time, and just wait to see what bubbled up was incredibly powerful. And really, all kinds of things were shared out of that sense that we could respect and trust each other enough to just be together.
And this is something that I also brought in from a larger scale, is that because we lost the clinicians, the director and the other clinician who was open dialogue informed, the institution, Servicenet itself, had to wrestle with the summer prior to us being hired, whether or not they were going to continue open dialogue at all. It's not an inexpensive process to train a team. It's not an inexpensive process to do the work. You have to have at least 2 clinicians in all the network meetings, and you don't get reimbursed for everything. And so at this sort of higher institutional level, which is, the institutional responsibility, they were discussing whether or not they were going to commit to this. And ultimately, it was a cliffhanger, from what I hear. I wasn't there. But it was a cliffhanger, and they did, and I'm so glad they did. And it created this interesting combination between the cultural humility frame that I was intentionally trying to bring in, because the young adults that we work with, age 16 to 30, are bringing with them a new experience, often to many of them, of these extreme states, but they're also dealing with the developmentally appropriate stages of identity and themselves. And on top of that, we have unlike Northern Lapland, we have a very diverse community in Western Massachusetts. And so the intersection between cultural humility and open dialogue yielded an interesting thing.
So I think I've talked a lot about what the training was and the experiential piece of it, so I'm going to go on. The non-hierarchical piece continues to be something that we talk about and struggle about. We had a conversation about it this week. The social work interns were in this training with their supervisor, who they had never met, who is also a trainee on the PhD level, and they were trying to figure out how to be present and share what was real for them while trying to impress their brand new supervisor. But we were able to have a conversation about that was something that was going on. We have peer specialists, and we really work in the network meetings there are two of us, at least two of us in every meeting, and that could be any two. I mean, there's typically one licensed person because that allows us to bill, but the second person may or may not be a licensed person, and we really, it doesn't feel to me like there's a big difference in the way the outcomes of those meetings, whether that second person is licensed or not. There are incredibly powerful outcomes that happen, and it really has more to do with the heart and the intention and the attention that's brought to the meeting.
And it's important to say the social network meetings, so that's one of the ways in which you do open dialogue, are non-hierarchical as well. So the intention, and probably imperfectly done at times, is for the clinicians and those quote unquote facilitating the network meeting to come in as non-experts and to come in as non-facilitators. And so to create a frame of non-hierarchy in the network meetings itself, that there is this sort of postmodern idea that the person and their network are the experts on themselves.
And I will, in full disclosure, say that it's really challenging to let that happen, because the families themselves want there to be a hierarchy. They want us to tell them what to do. And especially when I'm sitting in the room and I'm theoretically this, expert about medication, and I'm trying to step back and not talk about medication, but they'll sort of come back and say, but you're here and we have to talk about medication. So it's an interesting process to, what we want to do and what ideally the model looks like and what actually happens in the room.
So I think we've talked about this already, this idea of the process of the training itself created a space where we could talk to each other. We all became learners, and the learner position, the learner location is a tough location, but it helped to kind of equalize the playing field. And at the same time, our program was forming, that we're literally still at this moment figuring out our policies and how do we do what we do. And so it gave us this unique space for us to feel as a team, to feel very connected with each other and be able to challenge each other to create this program. I love it when my staff challenges me. It's super hard, but I love it when my staff challenges me. And I just told one of my staff the other day, I'm not an objective observer of myself. Please tell me how I'm being reflected in you. And that's painful and hard too, but really useful in the development of a program, I think. So to circle back to the principles, which as I was putting together this paper, it was sort of intentional, but it was oftentimes unintentional that we started engaging in these principles and how they married to each other. So we're recognizing change in power imbalances from cultural humility, and our own staff became a social network through the process of this training, which was sort of accidental and really cool.
Maybe not accidental, but definitely really cool. So polyphony is that process of hearing lots of voices, and there are polyphony in the team meeting is definitely challenging, and but it's also really, really rich. And so we continue to have conversations about, because the hierarchy and the polyphony really go together when people are feeling that, because we have a new set of interns now, And those new set of interns entered our program in September and have had 2 days of training because we're redoing the training again. So they've had 2 days of training, but they're entering into a team that has had a year of training. And so they didn't grow up with us sort of figuring this out together, and they're much less sure about whether it's okay to talk because of their role in the hierarchy. And so we're really kind of working on how to support them and how to let them know that it is okay, because they come with a lot of sense of what that hierarchy is supposed to look like.
One thing to add to that, Julie said that it's really hard to do the polyphony in the team meeting, and anybody who wants to try and institute this, I'll just let you know one of the reasons why it's really hard is that once your team really likes it, they get really good at it, and your team meeting could probably last all day. So it's, we're really good at dialogue, and it's really interesting. We have really rich discussions, and then I sort of hold this difficult place of having to play timekeeper to the polyphony, which is sort of, it goes against the whole point.
There was a lot of uncertainty among the staff as this program grew. And we didn't know each other. We didn't know our roles. I had historically worked with a younger population, so I didn't have much experience with psychosis, which meant that I didn't come with a whole set of ideas about how things should be done, which was helpful, but was also, has meant that I've been learning a lot this year. We didn't know each other. We didn't, all of it was happening all at the same time. And just to sort of add a little sprinkle of interest, our larger organization decided that because we were a small program, that we would be the perfect program to try out a new EMR, a new electronic medical record. And they decided that our second month of this new team was the perfect time to do that. And so we had this new EMR that no one in the agency knew how to use. And no one knew how to, when we had trouble, they had to go back to the drawing board to figure out how to solve our problems. And it all of a sudden meant that our communication was separate from the rest of the agency, because if we sent an email through our EMR, it didn't get to their EMR. And if they sent an email to us, we didn't get it. And then they were getting angry at us because we weren't responsive. And it was really, really challenging.
We started to call it the many pathways up the mountain, because there was a lot of different ways to do the same thing, and most of them were wrong.
And then there was a process where the clinicians had to put in a large amount of information into this new EMR before we could write notes. So it took 2 months?
Longer than that. We're just now getting really good at it. Probably by the turn of the new year, it got pretty good.
So there was this really long period of time where we would have this amazing interaction, and we had to, write it down on some piece of paper somewhere and hope that we would remember it when we could, in fact, finally enter it into the EMR a month later. So that was really challenging. But what all of that, and we were able to see this at the time, that we were sitting in this place that felt so powerless. We were so frustrated and so irritated because we had had no say in the timing of this, and no say in how things move forward, and no say in, where they decided to put this note and how we were supposed to find it. And we realized at some point that it was exactly parallel to the experience that the families and the participants were having with not knowing what their future was going to look like, and not knowing, how things were going to progress. And that obviously it wasn't the same degree, but it was, we got to sort of have this experience of how hard tolerating uncertainty is.
So then as we got more of our training and we got to know so we inherited this whole program full of participants that the previous clinicians knew. We got to know our participants in the dialogical milieu, as it were. Topics of oppressed identity started to arrive, of course. And so this is where the rubber hits the road. And so how I want to talk about it is by telling two sort of examples of how the topics of oppressed identity showed up. So the first one is the topic of race, which is a charged topic, particularly in our culture right now. It's a very charged topic. And there was an incident early in the fall, which only the interns witnessed, and then sort of in supervision and in discussion, all of us became aware of, where one participant who was African American approached another participant who was Chinese American and said what I think we've all heard many times before, "So where are you from?" And so the interns were witnessing this, and they're sort of first-year interns, and they start to get reactive and paralyzed. And the second participant goes, "Oh, well, I was born here." No, where are you from?" And he said, "Well, my family's from China." And the first participant goes, "Oh, I love Chinese people, ching chong ching." And my interns who then came to me afterwards are like, "Oh my gosh, that was horrible. What should we have done?" And so they then transferred their activation and their paralysis to me. And I'm like, I don't know what you should have done. Let's have a talk about this. Let's have a dialogue. And so we opened up the space and had a series of intentional staff dialogues where we talked about, and actually it was the interns who then did a presentation on cultural humility. And we had these really hard, really painful dialogues because we had, at the time we had a more diverse, but we had a racially diverse staff who, because we had the experience of the open dialogue training, we were all pretty vulnerable with each other and pretty raw. And we had these really raw discussions, and it became really clear that this is not cultural competence stuff. This is stuff that we're gonna have to create space for, like forever. Like we're gonna have to have an ongoing space for dialogue about this forever. And then the second of many oppressed identities that showed up in the dialogical space was the LGBTQ+. And this one has an interesting dimension to it as well, and a really raw dimension to it, because a good component of our staff identify in this way, and a good component of our participants identify with these oppressed identities, and everybody comes to it with different levels of awareness and different levels of experience and different levels of tolerance of being able to talk about these topics or even know how to use the terminology. And so one example that we literally talked about last week, and we're going to have to open up more dialogical space to talk about it some more. We're really good at talking. I'm very thankful that the staff shows up and participates in the way that they do, the brave ways that they do. But one example is that we started a practice of at community meeting and whenever we do introductions that people introduce their pronouns, which created this interesting space of dialogue where for some people that's very affirming that, now the community knows the pronouns that I prefer. And for other people, it creates a tough level of non-awareness of why am I doing this, and should I ask why I'm doing this, and this feels weird. And then there's a third group of people that have started to come forward, and they're like, actually, this is really outing, and I don't know if this feels good at all. Why are you mandating that we have to give you our pronouns? Maybe we don't know right now, or maybe we don't want you to know, and yet somehow we have to choose what our pronouns are in this very public space. And so that's a dialogue. That's not something that we're going to take a vote or come to a conclusion about. We just need to keep talking about that.
So you've heard about many of the challenges. One of them was at the end of April, the 3 interns who had been with us for 30 hours a week left because it was the end of their internship. And it was incredibly painful to have them leave because this team had really grown together. We had formed together, and they were as much a part of the team as any of the rest of us. And so there was really a mourning period that that happened, and some people celebrated, and we had some food, and but it was and some people needed to deal with it in their own private way. But there was the functional piece of them leaving, so they left at the end of April. We didn't get new interns until September. We had one intern over the summer, but there were the physical hours, and we don't have a big staff, and so there was also like, how are we going to cover the space? How are we going to actually do what we want to do without bodies? Which was another piece that was part of what we had to figure out. And thankfully, we had hired an amazing milieu specialist earlier in April, and so he was able to really help us get through the summer, because otherwise we would have been in a really stuck place. But it was very hard, and some participants left the program because they were very connected to these interns. And what we realized in that process was that we needed to provide psychological continuity, and that meant that we needed to have, if the interns were involved with participants, we also needed to make sure that they had other people that they were hooked into, who they felt safe with in the program, who were staying, who were staff. We wanted the interns to be able to have the experience of being primary clinicians, and the second-year interns do that. But we had to make sure that we were providing that sense of continuity that's so important in any kind of treatment.
So, what's the takeaway? What did we get out of any of this? And the first one is this sort of, probably you don't want to reproduce our toleration of uncertainty of a brand new staff in a brand new program, although it was happenstance for us. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking and dialoguing about how do we create any sort of continuity of these lovely things that we've created. And the first one, in relationship to what Julie was talking about, is just a really radically accepting acknowledgement that we're going to have a grief cycle every single year, because our program was built around 9-month interns, and they will come in and they will do their really good work, and then they will leave, and creating the space for that type of work and an acknowledgement of the grief that will be at the end of every single year, which is, quite frankly, a painful thing that our staff has to grapple with and really face. And not only that, but they're always going to come in now to a team that already knows all these principles. And so how is it that we're going to have a continuity of understanding, even of the theory of how we practice? And like I said at the beginning, the open dialogue informed type trainings are not inexpensive. And so I had to do a considerable amount of negotiation with our parent organization around the essential importance of continued training and how we were going to make that happen. And so we're going to continue to have the same training every single year until infinity. And that's just how it is. We have to keep doing that, because as we get new staff, and we need the refreshers, and we need the space to be able to do that hard work that Melanie Souchet talks about, and the open dialogue training and the experiential practices that were given to us. We're now doing sort of how do we keep it inside our program, and how do we continue doing these practices, is the perfect container to be able to do the vulnerable and really hard work.
And it helps us recreate a team that's bonded with each other through that training. So we really, in order to really fully incorporate the new interns, we need to have a process with them that is meaningful and honest, and this ongoing training lets us do that.
And that's it. Yes.
My understanding of the social network and open dialogue, right, is that there's open discussion among the clinicians in front of the family and whoever is the identified patient, correct? So everything is open, and they listen. They listen to how the clinician discuss, even if they have some disagreements, they talk about it, but it's done openly in front of the family and whoever is there. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the question was, or the comment was that your understanding of open dialogue was this sort of reflection of the clinician's thoughts right in front of the social network. And that's absolutely how it's done. That it's born out of the, like the 1970s, 1980s reflecting teams that were behind the two-way mirror, and how sort of that felt to have people talking about you behind a two-way mirror, and so then incorporating those reflecting teams into the team. And the way, there's different ways to practice, there's sort of different styles of open dialogue happening, and the way in which we were taught is to incorporate that right into the facilitators. And so you can do sort of a reflection, and you can do reflective talk, which is then not directly addressing anybody, and we also will then take a time, once, twice, if necessary, more than that, throughout the network meeting, where we talk to each other in front of the family. And that sounds super weird, and we tell them this is going to feel super weird. And we do a lot of the training through role play, and my experience of it is actually really cool. It's like you get to eavesdrop into your clinician's thoughts or someone's thoughts about you in front of you. It's really cool.
And people get to feel, families and clients get to feel really heard, that we, they know that we got it. Or they know that we didn't. Right, exactly, yeah. Right.
I wanted to make a couple of comments and have a couple of questions. Comments number one, it sounds to me like it's wonderful that you've been able to open up the process, because for so long there's been kind of a black box in regards to somebody goes into treatment and then what happens? Make them better. Number two question is, how do you educate your community to be willing to identify themselves or their family members as needing this? Because for so long there's been a lot of shame and guilt and hiding of the crazy aunt and the attic kind of a thing. There seems to be an inconsistency, though, that I want to caution you about. The tolerance of uncertainty. Why should you feel an obligation to be able to predict what's going to happen? When you see people individually in the other models, I always say to my patients, I will never know more than 5 to 10% of you and the things that are important to you. I'm trying to clear away the underbrush so you can use your capacities to the best ability. So why put that expectation upon yourselves? And why should families have that? If they're dealing with, 16 to 30-year-olds, you shouldn't know what your 16 or 30-year-old is doing 24/7. When we have people in hospital, adolescents may be doing the same things that their peers are doing in the community, but we're following them 24/7 and saying, oh, well, this is a problem. I said, no, it's not a problem. They need the space to experiment. And you need, in my opinion, to be willing to acknowledge that in your staff and to say that to the families or whomever sends people to you. You can't control and predict. You're trying to help people develop their own capacity to make decisions and judgments that are not harmful to them or others, and then you have to let them go. This is my comment and question here. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if everybody caught all that, but it was you talked, I think, very eloquently about toleration of uncertainty. And all that I would say is that I agree. That's what toleration of uncertainty is. That, but I think so many of us, and not just participants, not just people in the mental health system, but we all want certainty. I want to know that I'm going to go home and that everything's going to be okay and that my family's going to be okay, and that this model really calls that out and says, nope. You can't tell, you don't know anything for sure. And just because we're named as the experts, we probably kind of know even less than that because I'm not you. So yeah, absolutely. And your other question was about how do we identify folks?
How do you educate the community
Yeah.
for early identification of people who are having extreme states?
Yeah.
Most of the time they try and hide it.
Right. So how do we identify people for early identification of people who are having extreme states? And that is the problem. That it's something that PrEP is charged with, and we're charged with a whole heck of a lot, that we're supposed to sort of serve the whole western side of the state, and we just don't have the capacity to, especially since we're not mobile, although I am in talks perhaps with DMH to get us a mobile team. We're not mobile, and we have one building, and we have clinicians who are doing, I think, a really good job in understanding this process, but we are contextualized in a system of clinicians who are doing their very best and have no idea.
I'll give you a suggestion. 50 years ago, Institute for Juvenile Research in Chicago, Illinois, sent teams out throughout the state to educate people about how they saw issues and what was available as a resource. So then people could self-refer rather than have to be brought in by the, I don't know, the police or some kind of nonsense like that. Send people out to the community, and then they'll probably want to question you in the open dialogue kind of a situation. Say, okay, fine, you know, and if you do it that way, I think you have a pretty good chance of getting people earlier. Take away the shame. Okay, this is a public health issue.
Yeah, so we have gone out to primary care providers. We're talking to schools. We're really trying to get out into the community. There's also a study that's in process in the Hartford area where they're actually putting billboards up, and there are two programs that are being compared, a program in Hartford and Prep East, and they're trying to see if they can get people in, you know, if these sort of more extensive and creative ways of getting out into the community really do help people get into treatment earlier. And I think if that's the case, then that will sort of trickle down to more of our treatment options.
And we have to finish. I'm sorry, I was just given the time that we ran all the way up to our time. But certainly, Julie and I are here and available. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to talk to anybody. Thank you very much.